For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mary Ann Savakinis. I'm the director of the Lackawanna Historical Society, and it is my privilege today to introduce our speakers for the program From Pine Brook to the White House, a look back at Joe Biden's Scranton roots. Our first speaker tonight to begin the program has been spending a lot of time at the Historical Society during the COVID shutdown. He made some appointments and came in and was researching his family history. And in researching it, he just happened to mention one day that he has the same roots as Joe Biden. He follows one of the same lines. So when the Project 46 committee came to the Historical Society and asked if we could do a program on Joe Biden's roots, I went right to Tim and asked if he could help us out with this. And very, very kindly, he agreed to do this. So I want to express my appreciation to him. Our speaker to begin the program is Tim Hinton. He's a partner in the law firm of Haggerty, Hinton, and Cosgrove, which was formerly Haggerty, McDonald, and O'Brien, and it's located in Dunmore. Tim Hinton is a 1987 graduate of the University of Scranton, where he received a BS in economics and spent 1 year working for the Navy Department in DC. He then attended Duquesne University School of Law from 88 to 91, and during law school was a member of the Law Review. Mr. Hinton began the practice of law in 1991 and is board certified as a civil trial attorney by the National Board of Trial Advocacy. He has maintained that certification for the past 19 years. Attorney Hinton has been designated as a super lawyer in Pennsylvania by Philadelphia Magazine every year since 2010. Tim spends a considerable amount of time representing newspapers concerning various legal issues, including defamation and First Amendment matters, and handling civil rights litigation. He resides in Dixon City with his wife, attorney Teresa Hinton, and they are the proud parents of 4 adult children. Tim is with us today to share his story of how his family roots are connected to Joe Biden's roots. Tim, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mary Ann. Thank you very much for that introduction. And I'm very glad to be here. This is a pleasure. This has been a real labor of love the last 8 or 9 months, exploring my family history. And I want to introduce our co-presenter tonight too, Tom Cummings, who is my cousin and my friend since our days at the University of Scranton together. I think back then I didn't realize how we were related. He always reminded me that we were. He knew our family history much better than I did. And Tom is a partner with the law firm of Doherty, Leventhal, and Price, where he has worked for the last 29 years. He is a graduate of the University of Scranton and the Dickinson School of Law. He practices primarily in the areas of workers' compensation, Social Security, disability, and personal injury. He's also been designated as a super lawyer in the state of Pennsylvania by Philadelphia Magazine. He's a frequent lecturer. He is a former president of the Young Lawyers Division of the Lackawanna County Bar Association. And tomorrow, he will take the mantle as the new president of the Lackawanna County Bar Association tomorrow, which is a great honor, and elected by all of his peers, the other 700 lawyers in Lackawanna County. He's the husband of Patricia O'Rourke, and he is the father of 2 lovely daughters, Margaret and Chloe. So you're going to hear from Tom Cummings tonight as well. So let me start by saying how I got involved in this. About 9 months ago, my children signed me up for Ancestry.com, and I jumped in, and it's really an easy program to work, and it's interesting to build out the trees, and the Ancestry.com throws you hints, and you just build the profile out, and I started doing that for all 8 of my great-grandparents. I had a picture of each one of my 8 great-grandparents and really started building the trees out. And my family, my mom and dad are both from Scranton. My dad has the same name as me, Tim Hinton. My mom was Susie Jenkins. She grew up on North Washington Avenue, about 3 doors up from Governor Casey. My father grew up in the middle of Richmond Street, one of 11 children. And, but my dad had to move out of the area when I was a really young child, a couple of years old, and wound up working for IBM down in Maryland. So I grew up in Maryland through high school. My dad had gone to St. Paul's and the University of Scranton, and every chance he could, and my mother, they would take me and my 2 sisters to Scranton on the holidays and in the summertime, and we loved Scranton. I mean, growing up in the Washington, D.C. area, which is so transient, you don't have the family connections that you have in Scranton. So we loved Scranton, and after law school, when I started having children, I convinced my wife to move to Scranton so that we could raise our children there, because I missed out on that as a child, and this is where I wanted to be. So Tom Cummings and I wound up talking about my new entry into Ancestry.com, and he had been in it for a couple of years beforehand, so he helped me along the way. And we really wound up talking on a weekly basis, and sometimes more, daily. If we had a new find in our family, we would share it, and we would dig even deeper. And in this process of Ancestry.com, it really does help that Tom and I are lawyers, because we had access to the Register of Wills office, the Recorder of Deeds office, the Assessor's office in Lackawanna County. We wound up looking at census. The census records are very important. Death certificates, marriage applications. It really is a tedious process, but gosh, I really enjoyed it. One of the things that I would tell you today in doing this type of research, newspapers.com is just completely invaluable. It is a great tool to have access to all these newspapers around the country in a great search engine. And we found out so much information about our family from the newspapers. And I would also tell you that old photos are priceless. A lot of times you'll get photos from the 1800s, early 1900s, and you don't know who the people are. It would help so much if there's writing on the back of these photos to tell you who's in them. But we found out a lot of information, so we really enjoyed that. But Tom and I, our ancestry is common because of the Clark family, and I'm going to explain how that, a lot about the Clark family, and that's how we are related to the Blewitts, and therefore related to Joe Biden. So I'm going to go to the next slide and show you a picture of my great-grandmother. Her name is Margaret Clark Scanlan, and she was a lovely woman, a woman of great faith and humility, just loved by everyone in her family. And I was her oldest great-grandchild, and she passed away in the year 2000 at the amazing age of 102. So I was 35 years old when my great-grandmother passed away. And we had a great celebration of her life when she was 100 at the St. Mary's Center, and a video was made about her life. It's out on YouTube for anybody who wants to search that. And we also handed out a family tree at the celebration from 1998. And you can see Margaret Clark Scanlan in the middle, and her husband, John Joseph Scanlan, who left us in 1956. And Margaret didn't pass away until the year 2000. And you can see all of the families that are Margaret's children and their spouses and their children. I'm down on this bottom rung right here. So I'm very proud of my family. It's always a pleasure to get together with them. We don't do it often enough. But that was about the extent I knew of our family. I found out around the time of this celebration who Margaret's parents were, Patrick and Margaret Clark, Maggie Clark, but really didn't know anything about them. So when my kids signed me up for Ancestry.com, I really got focused on Margaret and John Scanlan, mainly because I knew Margaret the best. My other great grandparents had died so long ago when I was a child, a small child, but I was around for a long time during Margaret's life. So I became focused on that. And I was here in Scranton. Now, Margaret, I want to have Tom explain this photo here, but these are the Clark sisters minus one, Geraldine, the oldest sister of the Clark sisters who died in 1929. So Tom, if you could tell everybody about this photo.
Thank you, Tim. When Tim and I would talk about the ancestry and the common lineage and the tree and the research, he mentioned earlier photos. They're so very important. And Tim had a copy of this photo, and I'm very familiar with this photograph because this photograph was taken on my parents' wedding day. You can see if you look into the window in the background outside, there's a reception going on. And if I know the Clark and the Healy family, it was a rip-roaring time. If you look at the photograph, the woman in the dark dress, third from the right, that is my grandmother, Elizabeth Clark. She is my mother's mother. She was the wife of Eugene Healy, my grandfather. Elizabeth was the sister of Margaret, who is to the left, the third from the left, and the white dress, lighter dress. That is Tim's great-grandmother, and she is sitting right next to her sister, my grandmother, Elizabeth Clark Healy. And as you can see from the photograph, you can see Pauline, Lucille, Margaret, Elizabeth, Lillian, and Cecilia. Those were 6 of the Clark sisters. And again, that photograph was taken June 15, 1949, the day of my parents' wedding, in my grandmother's apartment on the 800 block of Adams Avenue in Scranton.
All right. So the last names of my aunts here, Pauline Gillern, Lucille O'Hora, my great-grandmother Margaret Scanlan, Elizabeth Healy, Lillian Crimmins, and Cecilia Harrington. Okay, so those are the 6 Clark sisters in 1949. Okay, so their parents. Now, Tom talked about how priceless it is to get photos, and I don't even know where you got these photos, but the Clark sisters, these are their parents, and we're guessing, Tom, 1890. They were married in 1887 at St. Paul's. It wasn't St. Paul's then. It was called the Tabernacle or the Wigwam. It was a Hemlock Chapel on the same site as St. Paul's, which only opened in March of 1887. And they were married by the Reverend P.J. McManus in July of 1887 at St. Paul's, which has great significance to me because my dad graduated from St. Paul's in 1961. And my 4 children graduated from St. Paul's through the 8th grade, just in the last 10 years or so. So this is Patrick and Margaret, Mary and Clark, and this is how Tom and I are related. We have a common ancestor. These are my great-great-grandparents, and they're Tom's great-grandparents. So Tom, where did you get these photos?
Those photographs were given to me by my Aunt Paula Munchak. She tracked them down somehow, and it might have been through the Sullivans, Tim.
Okay, all right. And then this next photo is Patrick and Margaret Clark later on in life. Okay, and this photo came to us through Suzanne Gillern Sullivan's son, Dennis. And Suzanne was a great collector of family memorabilia, and she was out researching our family a long, long time ago. But she did not have the advantages of newspapers.com and some of the things that Tom and I were able to get access to go a little deeper than Suzanne was able to go. But I remember Suzanne sharing her notes with me in the 1980s when Suzanne and her husband Denny owned Hank's Hoagies, and they sold that to Tom Owens. And I mentioned Hank's only because President-elect Biden, that's one of his favorite stops when he goes to Scranton, is to stop at Hank's Hoagies. And he probably didn't know this, but Hanks was owned for about a decade by one of his relatives. So how did we get on to the Blewitts? All right, so Tom was able to get the death certificate for Patrick Clark, his great-grandfather, and the death certificates didn't start in Pennsylvania until 1906. And it became a uniform form like you see in front of you, and it has a lot of great information. And I highlighted the information that's critical for this connection back to the Blewitts, and it's the name of his mother, Mary Blewitt, and I highlighted it in yellow. And so that got us really focused on where, you know, looking down this path of the Blewitts. So one of the things Tom and I did was we also wanted to try and find Patrick and Margaret, Mary, and Clark's graves. And we wound up calling cemeteries, and I called the Cathedral Cemetery in Scranton. I talked to Kevin, and I said, do you have these people buried there? And Kevin looked it up, and he got back to me, and he said, yes, we do. And they pulled a grave card. And they pulled a grave card in an old section of the Cathedral Cemetery, and it lists who's buried in this plot. And it's Patrick Clark, buried in 1931, and his wife, Margaret, in 1939, and their daughters, Lillian Crimmins and Cecilia Harrington and Geraldine Clark Burton are all buried in that plot. But guess who owned the plot? The plot is owned by Edward and John Blewitt. I've highlighted that up above on the card up above. So that was another clue as to where we were going. And I don't want to get too focused on our family search and take over the program, because we want to talk about the Blewitts here. But what we did then with all of this information is went to newspapers.com, and you can see all of the funeral notices for members of the Blewitt family, Patrick Blewitt's family and Edward Blewitt's family, and who the pallbearers were in these families, who the flower carriers were in the family. And we started seeing the name Clark often in these news articles about their deaths. So then Tom and I traced out our lineage, and this is my chart here. Through all the research we did, going back to Edward Blewitt and Mary Mulderig, and then to my great-great-great-grandmother, three greats, her first husband, second husband, child Patrick Clark, then Margaret Clark, who we showed you pictures of, then my grandmother, Alice Scanlan, who was Margaret's firstborn, and then my dad. And then if you go to the connection here to the Blewitts, are Mary Blewitt and Patrick Pius Blewett were brother and sister. And then you trace down the chart all the way down to Joe Biden. In the connection, the relationships would be Patrick and Mary are siblings. The next blocks are first cousins, then second cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins. And the same thing we did for Tom. Now, the only difference between Tom's chart and my chart are in the final three boxes on the right. So instead of Margaret Clark Scanlan, you have Tom's grandmother, Elizabeth Clark, and her husband, and then down through. And Tom is a fourth cousin with, do I hit exit there, Tom? Maybe it'll just go. Just see if that'll go away there. So Tom and President-elect Joe Biden are fourth cousins. So that's, I know somebody in the chat feature asked, you know, how we're related to Joe Biden. This is how we're related, okay? So we could spend a lot of time talking about the Clarks and really a couple of hours and all of their children. But I know, you're here to talk about and hear about Joe Biden's roots in Scranton. And I must confess that I know we have some Finnegan relatives signed up for the program, and that's really not our focus, and not out of any disrespect. It's just that we didn't research that, all the Finnegan relations, because that wasn't in our family chain, and that wasn't the research we did. And it's funny, the Finnegans, I did meet one of the Finnegans from Harrisburg, went by the nickname In Again, Out Again Finnegan. He was a very close friend of my Uncle Brian Hinton. They were the same age, and it was a very nice guy and a lot of fun. So I do want to talk about Edward Blewitt. And this ship here, the Excelsior, is the ship that Edward and Mary Mulderick and their 8 children came to the United States in from Liverpool. And they arrived in New York on January 28th, 1851, which I will tell you from my research is a very strange time to take this 40-plus day journey across the Atlantic Ocean. And when we talk about the Blewitts, they're from Ballina, which is in the western part of Ireland. And they would have had to travel across Ireland and then across the Irish Sea to Liverpool, and then take this 40-day journey on a schooner in the dead of winter, which was a very perilous journey. Everything I've read about it, many people died. The American routes were safer than the Canadian routes. They called the Canadian routes the ships coffin ships because so many people died on them. But this was a dangerous journey, especially with all these children. You had to feed them on the ship. The hull of these ships where they all stayed and slept, smelly, were not sanitary. This was an arduous journey, what they did. And I want to tell you a little bit about Edward. Edward Blewitt and Mary and their 8 children are listed there. Edward was born, we believe, around 1805. The records we've seen are not entirely clear on that. There is some notations in the baptismal records in Ballina. And he married Mary Mulderick, and sometimes in the records you'll see her name as Reddington, and there's information that the names are synonymous. Edward appears in the parish records for Kilmore Moor in the town of Ballina. He worked as a surveyor in Ireland. He worked for the Army Engineers on the Ordnance Survey in Ireland, which was a huge job to diagram and survey all of the ditches and roads and rivers and everything in Ireland. And he worked on that project in the early 1840s. And his brothers, from what I've read, Thomas and James, were also surveyors in Ireland. We don't have any information about their parents, Edward and Mary Mulderick's parents. After they were done with the ordnance in the 1840s, he worked for the valuation office in Ireland. And then the famine, due to the potato blight, took hold around 1845 and was catastrophic for the country of Ireland. There were relief efforts from other countries, but the people in Ireland were starving. And the famine lasted till around 1850 or 51. Now, Edward and Mary and their family immigrated in January of 1851, which was late in the famine. I learned it cost about $18 per person to take this voyage. I also learned that County Mayo was one of the worst hit counties in Ireland due to the famine. One of Edward's last jobs in Ballina was to work as an overseer in the Ballina Union Workhouse, which was like a poorhouse. It was equipped to feed 1,200 people and give them a roof over their heads, and the need was triple that amount. And I understand from my reading it was a pretty deplorable place to live, but if you're starving, you had to do what you had to do. So how did they get to America? That's a very interesting story, and it brings in Patrick Pius Blowett, and some of the reports list him as Patrick F. Blowett, and some of them list him as Patrick Pius Blowett. Patrick Pius sounds a little bit more interesting, but he was born on April 5th, 1833 in Ardagh Parish, Ballina, County Mayo. And as a young man, he was preparing to attend Maynooth College in Dublin to study surveying and engineering like his dad. But when he was around 16 years old, his dad had picked out a girl for him to marry. And he did not want to marry this young lady. So he did, I guess, what some people do, and he fled. And he became a sailor. So in 1849, he took to the seas, and it wasn't easy. The first ship he was supposed to get on burned in the docks, and he didn't wind up sailing in that ship, but he did sign on with another vessel as a sailor, which wrecked off the coast of Chile, and he was stranded in South America for a while. But in a short period of time, a couple of years as a sailor, in his obituary, it's listed that he saw Hawaii, China, Japan, South America. He really traveled the world. And what a story for a young man to be that adventuresome as a 16, 17, 18-year-old. But he goes back to Ireland in late 1850, and he shepherds his mom and dad and his 7 siblings to America. And for some reason, they decided to settle in Scranton. Now, 1851 in Scranton, a little bit of information here. There is no Scranton at the time. It doesn't become a borough until 1856, and it's not incorporated as a city until 1866. But there are 3 boroughs or sections: Hyde Park, Slocum Hollow, and Providence. And eventually those 3 combine to form Scranton. But in 1851, there's about 3,000 inhabitants in those 3 boroughs, and the Blewitts arrive there. And they settle in Sandy Banks. Before I leave this slide, these are their 8 children. I've filled in their dates of birth and death as best I could. Tom and my relation is Mary. It's funny, in our notes in our family that Suzanne Sullivan had made, and I think she interviewed my great-grandmother, Nana Scanlan, as we affectionately called her. They refer to her as Mariah. And, but obviously her formal name was Mary, as shown on her son's death certificate. And then we have Patrick Pius next in age, and we have the rest of Edward and Mary's children who all came to America. The information I have is that Michael immigrated back to London at some point in time. But Catherine, we have a lot of information on Catherine. She died at the Maloney home out at the end of Greenridge. So we have that information. Now, Edward Blewitt, when he came to Scranton as an engineer and as a surveyor, he worked for the DL&W coal company. Now, that's the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad, but they also owned the coal mines, including the diamond mine, where Patrick Clark worked for 43 years. And he worked at the DL&W for a while, and then he worked at the Ox Pond I think it's really the Oxford mine, which was up in Hyde Park near Main Avenue. And in July of 1872, he died. Nobody saw how he died exactly, but they found him drowned in the Lackawanna River. Some young boys found him about 5 days after he had gone missing. And this article appeared, I think, in a Carbondale newspaper. And let me just tell you, Scranton, their newspapers really didn't take hold until after 1872. The news was pretty much reported by the Carbondale newspapers and the Pittston newspapers. Those areas were more mature, and they had better newspapers. The Scranton Republican was starting to take hold, but we found a lot more news in our searches through Carbondale and Pittston in the early days, the 1870s. Another article I didn't put up here, that Edward, after he died, he was taken back to his daughter's house in Sandy Banks, where he was waked. I don't know where he's buried. I don't know if he was taken to a church for a funeral. They don't have that information a lot of times for people that died in the 1870s. So I want to tell you that the Blewitts, if you can look at this map here, they really settled in an area called Sandy Banks. Now, Sandy Banks is in the left lower portion of this map, and a very small part of it is in the 16th ward of the city of Scranton, and a large part of Sandy Banks is in the 16th ward or 7th ward, which includes Pine Brook. And the Blewitts and the Clarks settled in the Sandy Banks region, which goes from Brook Street and Anthony Street. You can see it in the lower left-hand portion. And Sandy Banks ends at Micah Street. It's a really small area, but it was an Irish-American enclave dominated by Irish-American families. And it was in the shadow of the Dixon Manufacturing Company, which are those buildings in the center of the diagram, the machine shop, and you can't really read the writing. And then just above that is the Pine Brook breaker. And I'm going to show you pictures of those. Those structures almost completely overshadowed Sandy Banks. And I can only imagine how loud it must have been to live in this neighborhood in the shadow of these two structures. And right across the river, across the Olive Street Bridge, Olive Street was called Carbon Street back then. That bridge you see is now the Olive Street Bridge, and it leads to Scranton High School. And right in that area is the diamond mine owned by the DL&W Coal Company. And it was a huge mining operation on that side of the river. And we're going to talk about Phelps Street later in here. Phelps Street is up above towards the top of the picture, because up on Phelps Street, that's where Pius Blewitt settled down at 316 Phelps Street, and their family owned a house there for, I think, 80 or 90 years. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. This is the Dixon Manufacturing Company. Thomas Dixon was one of the richest men in America, the primary owner of this company. They built locomotives and lots of other things for the locomotive industry. This was right next door to Sandy Banks. And then the reason I'm bringing this up, this is on the other side of the river. This is where the diamond mine was. And you see Carbon Street there. And that area right there is called Diamond Flats that I'm showing you. And Patrick Clark and his wife Maggie, before they bought the family homestead at 104 Anthony Street, they lived in coal company housing. One of these houses here, we have the exact address. It's one of these houses here. And they, had no indoor plumbing. There were two wells on the street, one at one end of the street and one at the other end of the street. All of these houses had gardens in their backyards and a brick oven to make bread. They had chickens in the backyard and pigs, and and from what I read in old newspaper articles, it was a really vibrant, great neighborhood dominated by Irish American families with lots of kids. Right here you see Athletic Park, which is now Memorial Stadium. At Athletic Park, I'll tell you, Babe Ruth played there. Lou Gehrig played there. Really interesting. Now, this Carbon Street, if you can envision where Scranton High School is now, it would be in this area where my mouse is. This Carbon Street right now is named Mike Munchak Way. Mike Munchak is Pat and Maggie Clark's great-grandchild. Can you imagine how ironic that is that Pat and Maggie Clark, Maggie gave birth to 18 children. The first 2/3 of them were born here, including Tom's grandmother and my great-grandmother, born here on this street, not Anthony Street across the river, where the younger children were born. How ironic it is that this street is now named for their great-grandchild, Mike Munchak. Here is a picture of the diamond mine operation in 1905, and it looks like scorched earth, what a mining operation does to the land. Another picture of the diamond breaker. This is the Pine Brook breaker overshadowing parts of Mineral Avenue and a good section of Sandy Banks. And this is 104 Anthony Street. This was a great find for Tom and I through the assessor's office. The house was demolished in 1982 or 83, but they still had a card on the house where Mary Blewitt and her 10 children, 4 from her first marriage to Anthony Howley, and then 6 from her second marriage to Michael F. Clark, were brought up in this house. Now, the daughters at a young age were learning would go into service as domestics, 13, 14, 15 years of age. The boys, and there were only 3 boys, one Howley, who became a famous vaudeville actor nationally, a dancer, but the 2 Clark boys, James and Patrick, went across the river to work at the diamond mine as slate pickers at a young age. Tragically, James died at the age of 31, and Patrick, we know, went on to live for a good long life. This is a picture of downtown Scranton, the Penn Avenue, Franklin Avenue area. This building right here is the Dixon Manufacturing building here. It's now the Pennsylvania Paper Company building. You can see in the upper left-hand portion parts of Sandy Banks here. You can see the Scranton State Hospital here. That brings us to Patrick Pius Blowett. Now, Patrick Pius Blowett, I told you how he arrived here in Scranton. He shepherded his family to Scranton. I'm not sure they would have gotten here without him. He worked for a while in Scranton. In 1854, he was with the Delaware and Hudson Railroad as a draftsman. In 1857, he married Catherine Scanlan, another prominent Irish family who had arrived in the Sandy Banks area in 1847. They got married in a church at the corner of Franklin and Spruce Street by the Reverend Moses Whitty. But Patrick had an adventuresome spirit. And in 1857, he took his wife and they went to Iowa, and they brought many Scrantonians with them to open the first coal mines in the state of Iowa. They didn't last too long there. Flooding made that mine go bust. Some of the Scranton men stayed there and drifted into agriculture, but Patrick and Catherine, they came back to Scranton, but they didn't stay long. They went to New Orleans to work on a railroad extension in New Orleans, where their oldest child, Joe Biden's great-grandfather, Edward F. Blewitt, was born in New Orleans. They then returned to Scranton for a while, but again, they picked up and left, and they went to Brazil, Rio de Janeiro, where Patrick worked on a contract to build a new railroad line there in Rio de Janeiro. He got stuck in South America during the Civil War due to the embargo of South American ports. He returned to Scranton in 1866 for a short time and then went to the oil fields of Western Pennsylvania to lay out railroad lines. But in 1871, he returned to Scranton for good. He accepted a position in the engineering department of the Delaware and Hudson Railroad. He later became the county surveyor for Luzerne County. Lackawanna County wasn't formed yet. He surveyed the Lackawanna Road and its Bloomberg branch. He was elected to the school board in 1873. There was contention over that election. There was an alternate slate of directors that challenged the election. It sounds familiar to what we've got going on the last couple of months. But Biden's slate of directors won out. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled in their favor, and he was on the school board. He then worked as a surveyor for the city of Scranton. He surveyed many of the early lots, many of the lots in the early days of Scranton. His maps in Scranton were considered authoritative. He he took over a coal mine at another point in time, the Greenwood coal mines, which was not successful. He really found his long-lasting job in the 1870s when he was appointed as a coal mine inspector for the territory in Luzerne County that encompasses present Lackawanna County and everything north of Pittston. Those were his mines for inspection. I'll get back to his children in a minute. But this is a news article that appeared in 1873. And as you can see, it says mine statistics. Through the kindness of Mr. Patrick Blowett, mine inspector for this district, we are enabled to lay before our readers the following list of important statistics for the year 1873. How many deaths there were, how many accidents, how many tons of coal, how many orphans, how many widows, which mines were ventilated. Great detail. Patrick Blewett was a highly respected mine inspector. When he died, his obituary used the saying that he always made sure there were ample support was left for the roof of the mines that he inspected. And he spent 23 years working as an inspector. He retired around the year 1900, and he did consulting work after that. These are his children, Patrick, Pius. He actually had 13 children. Like a lot of young Irish American families in these days, a lot of children died in early childhood. But these 8 children survived into adulthood, and there's their names and ages. And Edward F. Blewitt is the child to whom Joe Biden is connected. Edward F. is Joe Biden's great-grandfather. His daughter, Geraldine, is Joe Biden's grandmother. And second child, Nora, married David Roach, and Julia and Genevieve and Teresa and Francis, William, and Angela. Julia was a teacher at the John Adams School in Prime Brook for many years. Angela, I'll show you her obituary, died in 1968, which she lived a long life. She and her sisters lived at 316 Phelps Street for many years. And I'm talking a house through the assessor's office. We're able to prove that they owned this house for 80, 90 years. And the house still stands today. I took this picture over the weekend. This is the house. It's never been torn down. There's siding on it now. And it's been covered a little bit. You can tell from the chimney, it's a very old house, wrought iron fence, but it's still there to this day, right in central Scranton near Mesco Glass on Phelps Street. So Patrick's wife died before him in 1901, Catherine Scanlan Blewitt. Her funeral was held at St. Peter's Cathedral. She's buried at Cathedral Cemetery. Patrick died in 1911, and his funeral was also held at St. Peter's, and he's buried in Cathedral Cemetery with her. There were many news reports at the time of his death, and he is described as one of the sturdy pioneers of Scranton. Clearly, he was an energetic and adventuresome young man. You can tell by the jobs he took and his fearlessness at traveling around the world. But as he settled in Scranton around 1870, you could tell from the jobs he had as city engineer and county surveyor and mine inspector, he was committed to the development of Scranton and improving the working conditions for miners. It was said that he possessed a strong and vigorous constitution, that he led an upright life and was held in the highest esteem. It is without a doubt that he was an extremely influential man who had a great impact on the lives of northeastern Pennsylvanians. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Tom, who's going to talk about Patrick's firstborn child. Now, before I do that, I didn't have this in the program until I talked to Tom and Mary Sweeney, and I talked to their cousin, Tom Langan, Chops, as he goes by. And they gave me an interesting story, and I have to share it before we move on to Edward F. Blewitt. And they told me the story of Edward Blewitt, Patrick's father, Edward Blewitt, who came here in 1851, and his brothers were back in Ireland. One of his brothers, Thomas, who was shot and killed in Ireland, leaving 5 younger children. And Edward met those children in New York City in 1856 or 1857. Mary Sweeney would know these dates, I think, and ushered them back to Scranton, where they were raised and came into this world. And there's a book about their lives. I think it's called Celia, and it's about Thomas's children and coming up in America. And it's written by one of the descendants in that line of the Blewitts, which I thought was extremely interesting. And Chops Langan has promised to send me a manuscript as best he could of this book, because I'm fascinated and I do want to read it. So I just wanted to interject that before we move on to Edward F. Blewitt. So Tom, I'm going to let you take over from there.
Thank you, Tim. And I see Mary Sweeney and Tom Sweeney are holding up a picture, or not a picture, they're holding up a copy of that book, Celia. So interesting. All right. Well, Tim, thank you. Thank you for asking me to get involved in this. As you mentioned, we're cousins, longtime friends, and now fellow genealogists. So Tim has done the lion's share of the work on this project, and I thank him for that. But he called me over the weekend and said, hey, would you mind jumping in and telling us and presenting about Edward F. Blewitt? And I said, I'd be happy to do so. So Edward F. Blewitt, Edward Francis Blewitt, was born in New Orleans on January 2nd, 1859. And he was the son of Catherine Scanlan Blewitt and Patrick Pius Blowett, who Tim just told us about. And Edward was their first child. We know from the 1860 federal census that the Blewitts were back in Scranton from New Orleans by July of 1860. Edward Francis Blewitt attended Lafayette College, graduated in 1879, received a bachelor's degree in civil engineering, so he followed in the family tradition of engineering. Edward Blewitt was class president of Lafayette College for his senior year. Throughout the remainder of his life, Edward remained active in Lafayette College alumni affairs. He served as president of the Lafayette College Alumni Society on several occasions, and his sons, his two sons, Robert and Arthur, both attended Lafayette. In 1879, Edward married Mary Ellen Stanton. She was born in Scranton, a native Scrantonian. She was the daughter of Joseph Stanton and Mary Arthur. Edward and Mary Ellen Stanton had 4 children. Gertrude, who was born in 1880, Robert, born 1881, Arthur, born 1884, and Geraldine, born 1887. Now, Geraldine Blewitt, we'll learn her later on in my presentation, she is the grandmother of President-elect Joe Biden Geraldine married Ambrose Finnegan. In 1888, unfortunately, Edward's wife, Mary Ellen, died of typhoid pneumonia at the age of 28, leaving Edward to raise 4 young children under 10 years of age. Now, attesting to Edward's sense of civic duty, he was a school controller and school director in Scranton in the early 1880s. And in 1884, he was selected as city engineer for Scranton. He worked for Mayor Terrence Powderly. Terrence Powderly is better known not only as the mayor of Scranton, but he was the national leader of the Knights of Labor in the 1880s, and that was a national labor organization. Tim spoke earlier about Edward Blewett's, or he didn't mention that, Tim, I'm sorry. There's a paycheck, and Tim's going to put that up now on the screen. If you look, there was an article in the Sunday Times a few weeks ago, and this is a paycheck that was made payable to Edward Blewitt February 2nd, 1884, and that was signed by Mayor Terrence Powderly. So very interesting. There was an article, a gentleman in Scranton collects these artifacts and memorabilia, and when Joe Biden was elected president, the Scranton Times did a wonderful article about this particular paycheck and its historical significance. Now, while Edward Blewitt was city engineer from 1884 to 1893, some pretty significant developments took place. They included the first laying of asphalt pavement in the city, the renaming and laying out of the city streets, the first free delivery of mail in Scranton, and the planning and construction of the city sewer system, much of which remains in place today. In his capacity as a professional civil engineer, Edward was an expert on coal mining operations, especially the value of coal and the value of the mines that produce the coal. And in that capacity, he uncovered a system, a scheme actually, that was being utilized by coal mine company operators, where they would lease coal producing properties to shell companies and third parties to avoid paying taxes. And his efforts in discovering this and bringing it to public light allowed for the fair assessment of the coal mining operators so that the coal companies would pay their fair share of taxes. Now, in 1897, Edward Blewitt moved to Guadalajara, Mexico. There, he took the position of chief engineer for that city, and he later became chief engineer for the state of Jacinto in Mexico, where Guadalajara is located. So for about the next 10 years, Edward traveled back and forth, was mainly in Mexico. He oversaw the construction of the sewer and water systems for the city of Guadalajara. Now, in 1897 dollars, that cost $3 million. Adjusting for today's purchasing power, that figure would be the equivalent of over $100 million. So that was a pretty large endeavor. And while he was in Mexico, he had other enterprises. He also founded a private business endeavor called the Lackawanna Mining Company. In the early 1900s, he also founded the Edward F. Gold Mining Company, and that was a public traded gold and silver mining operation in the state of Montana. In 1906, Edward Blewitt returned to Scranton, and in May of that year announced his candidacy for a seat representing Scranton as a state senator in the Pennsylvania state legislature. He ran as a Democrat, secured the primary nomination, and in November of 1906, he was elected to a 4-year term in the Pennsylvania state legislature. Now, that 4-year term proved to be a busy and prosperous tenure for Edward. He advocated and supported legislation that reads as a laundry list for progress and prosperity. He advocated for pension benefits for Civil War veterans. He championed wage rights and the 40-hour work week, especially for coal miners. He advocated for a state highway system. He helped create a state workers' compensation system for workers injured on the job. He pushed through legislation that helped fund the construction of hospitals in small mining towns. He enacted laws to criminalize the practice of pillar robbing in the coal mines, and he proposed legislation to organize and fund rescue operations for coal mining accidents. Newspaper accounts during his tenure in the legislature described Edward Blewitt as a fierce advocate for the interest of his constituents in Scranton and a strong advocate for the working man. His efforts in the state Senate caught the attention of the statewide Democratic Party leaders, who approached him in the first year of his term and asked that he run for the office of state treasurer. Edward Blewitt refused that, citing his duty to complete the term for which he was elected. In 1910, he was up for re-election. The slate was crowded. There were 4 parties that put up candidates. The Democratic Party, who nominated Edward Blewitt, the Republican Party, the Socialist Party, and the Prohibition Party. Edward was defeated in that 4-way race. He lost his seat to a gentleman named Walter McNichols. But he stayed in the public eye. In 1912, he was still involved in politics. He organized and led the Scranton delegation to the Democratic National Convention in Baltimore. That same year in 1912, he was named mining engineer for the city of Scranton. In the following year, he was named to the City of Scranton Mine Cave Commission. He was always civic-minded. He was a lifelong member of the Fraternal Order of Elks. He served in numerous local and statewide leadership roles with the Elks. He was a staunch supporter of what was then called the St. Joseph's Foundling Home, which is today St. Joseph's Center. He also was a co-founder of the local Irish American Society, and that is the precursor of today's Friendly Sons of St. Patrick of Lackawanna County. He served in numerous roles over the years with that organization and helped organize their first and annual dinners. In 1919, he was a key organizer of the Welcome Home events and parades, welcoming and feting the local veterans returning from World War I. I mentioned earlier that his first wife passed away in 1888. He did remarry. He married a woman named Mary Ann Blackwell. She was a native of Hazleton. They did not have any children, and she passed away in 1934. The 1920 federal census documents show Edward Blewitt residing with his daughter Geraldine and her husband Ambrose Finnegan at 1209 Woodlawn Street in Scranton. That 1920 census also shows Eugenia Finnegan, age 2 years and 6 months, residing in that same household. And we all know Eugenia Jean Finnegan is the mother of our president-elect. Edward Blewitt died on May 26, 1926. At that time, he resided at 912 Delaware Street in Scranton. His obituary sang his praises as an active figure in political and fraternal life in this county for 4 decades. His funeral was well attended and conducted at St. Paul's Church in the Greenridge section of Scranton, and he's buried in St. Catherine's Cemetery in Moscow. I'd like to close out my section on Edward Blewitt by reading you a poem. And this is a poem that was written by Edward Francis Blewitt in 1923. And it reads as follows. How kind the years, my friend, have been to you. No sign of infirmity yet intrude on thy honored form, nor does time undo thy brilliancy or mental attitude. A charmed life thou seemeth to possess, filled to the overflow with noble thought, jeweled in richness and the tenderness, which is born of greatness, inborn, unsought. Were I to pay full tribute to your years and concentrate your virtues all in one, I would inscribe your name among the seers and name you Lackawanna's foremost son. Now, those words were written by Edward F. Blewitt in February of 1923 as a tribute to his good friend, Lackawanna County President Judge H.M. Edwards. Little did Edward know, almost 100 years ago later, that those same words, Lackawanna's foremost son, could be used to describe his great-grandson and the next president of the United States, Joe Biden. So, Tim, I thank you, and I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Tom. That was beautiful. So we're almost done with the program here, and there were a few takeaways that that I took from this project. And one of them I have on the screen here, that St. Patrick's Day. I don't know that we got into this, but Edward F. Blewitt was, some news reports say, the founder of the Irish American Society or Committee, which was the precursor of the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick. And this is just a news article here. Lists him as the manager of the society or committee. Was at the German hotel at the time, but he was either a co-founder or the founder of the society, which is thriving to this day. We have a dinner every St. Patrick's Day with 1,200 men in black tie, and it is a great event. And Edward F. Blewitt was a founder or co-founder of that organization. what I really wanted to impart during this program, we've heard so much during the political campaign that Joe Biden is just a scrappy kid from Scranton, but that really doesn't tell the story. When Tom and I did this research, we were astounded by the importance of Joe Biden's ancestors in Scranton. They truly were early pioneers of Scranton that had such an impact on the development of Scranton. And we wanted to tell that story more than, encompassing all of Joe Biden's relations and Irish roots. We were focused on Scranton, and particularly Patrick and then Edward, and the impact they had on the development of Scranton that was going through such change from the time they arrived here in January of 1851, when there were about 3,000 residents, till 1915, 1920, when there were 150,000 residents in Scranton, and it was the richest per capita city in the country. So just profound change going on. And these two men in particular were very important for the development of Scranton. So Joe Biden's roots in Scranton are deep and they're strong. And they were public servants. They were teachers. Angela Blewitt was the supervisor for the arts for the Scranton School District for 40 years. She never married. She ended her career at Marywood. Led an exemplary life. One of the awards to this day, I believe, in the Scranton School District is named in her honor. And I believe that Joe Biden's ancestors in Scranton laid a great foundation for him to become a public servant and to dedicate his life to the public good. The other takeaway I have from this research, I showed you my family tree, and we're distant cousins from Joe Biden, as well as so many other people. And doing this research, it's astounding how many cousins Joe Biden has, and it's a product of the large Irish American families. A lot of these families had 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 kids. And our families were no different. My dad was one of 11 and so on. So I would venture a guess. I know that my great-grandmother had 49 or 50 grandchildren and 114 or 115 great-grandchildren, all of whom would be cousins of Joe Biden. Tom has the same. I think he has 45 to 48 grandchildren and over 100 great-grandchildren, and so on. And so that's not even getting to Patrick Clark's other 9 siblings who would all be related because of their mother. And then you have all of the other Blewetts, the Tom Blewitt and the John Blewitt and all of their children. So the takeaway there is, and I don't think our area really realizes that there could be 500 to 1,000 relations in northeastern Pennsylvania to this day, and certainly throughout the United States. And I watched a lot of clips from Ireland when Joe Biden was vice president, and he went to Ireland and met all of his Blewitt cousins over in Ballina, and he had tons of relations there. So I think it is great that we share a common ancestry. I'm proud of it. I was excited to tell my aunts and uncles about it when we discovered it. And one of my best friends, Brian Hoban, I play golf with him all the time, and I shared this, and he gave me his often repeated line of, "Don't go thinking you're better than me." And so I got a big kick out of that, and I don't, but I certainly am proud of this common ancestry. And I thank you all for listening to us tonight. Tom and I both wanted to share this research with all of you, and we were glad that Mary Ann asked us to participate in this program.